Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loop and Learn's T1D educational series. And this evening, we're talking about, or this morning, and wherever you're watching from, Temp Basal versus Automatic Bolus with Kathryn Gentile. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What I put on the slide is that she has tons of affiliations. It would fill up my entire slide. She is also a T1D looper, and she works with Integrated Diabetes Services. And we've heard frequently from Gary Shiner, who started the IDS. So as we always do, here is the disclaimer that the Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm to help automate insulin delivery. It is experimental and not approved by the FDA, and patches and customizations, which are easy to do now, are even more experimental. This presentation is provided to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes self-management. You take full responsibility for building and running the system and do so at your own risk. I'll give you a little heads up on some of the things you'll be seeing on the Facebook page from open mic events that are coming up. So this Monday, this is a follow-up to today's presentation. So it's a follow-up on any questions you might have about Temp Basal versus Automatic Bolus or any other looping questions. It's an open mic. This will not be recorded. And however, it could be recorded. I'm not quite sure yet, but probably not. We don't generally do that with open mic nights. Special host on this event is John Fawcett. He's the father of a daughter who has type 1 diabetes, a developer of Loop Follow, Sugar Pixel, and the original Loop patches. And Mike Plant, an admin with Loop and Learn, a T1D, and I kind of think of him as the quiet admin behind so many solutions and testing new apps. That's this coming Monday. Then Thursday, next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, we have another open mic that I just call totally open mic. It's completely open to any questions, any issues you might have. And Carol Vachon is going to be hosting that. I've now added time zones in Australia because I posted in the Aussie Facebook group, and I had people showing up about 3 hours ago, not knowing that they had an Eastern time as well. So we'll start adding time zones to help you all figure out when we're on. Kathryn is going to talk to us today about Temp Basal versus Automatic Bolus. She'll help us understand when to use Automatic Boluses or Temp Basals, as well as address related topics in DIY Loop. She has, oh, you can see this. She has an MS and a lot of other degrees and certifications and stuff. She is Director of Exercise Physiology for Integrated Diabetes Services, a teen and young adult specialist, and has been living with type 1 diabetes since the age of 12. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in Exercise Physiology from Ave Maria University in Florida and a master's degree in Clinical Exercise Physiology from Westchester University in Pennsylvania. She is certified the American College of Sports Medicine as well as the International Sports Science Association. She's got a lot of stuff, and I think it's fabulous. So I am going to stop screen share, and if I can find it, and turn this over. Let me see if I can close this. There we go. And turn this over to Kathryn. Thank you so much for showing up tonight, helping us with your great expertise and teaching us all. We love it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm really happy to be here. And I too am a part of the Loop and Learn site and will sometimes utilize it to get information on things as well. So truly such a good place and resource that we have. Send people to the videos all the time. So it's great space for people that are looping. I personally have been looping for coming up on like 5 years now. I of course started with Temp Basal only because at the time that was the only dosing strategy available. But as soon as Auto Bolus was made an option with the dev branch, I remember I had to like go into GitHub and get the coding from there. Wasn't on the docs or anything like that. So kind of right from the get-go started that Automatic Bolus dosing strategy. So I am a big fan of both. And I think it really is dependent on each individual's current lifestyle and and situation for determining what the best dosing strategy for you is going to be. I'll also touch on the ability to utilize both Temp Basal only and auto bolus, because I think that that's also an important feature that can be really helpful. And I personally utilize with a lot of my younger patients that I work with, and it works very nicely. So we'll go over that too. I put together a few slides just because sometimes I go off on little tangents. So some slides to keep me on track. So I can share screen just so you can look at them, because I did put little images on there as well that I think are helpful to see. Do you see AB versus Temp Basal only on my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So, oops, I already messed it up. So these are both calculated a little bit differently. So we have auto bolus, which is taking 40% each loop cycle. So that's in the every 5-minute intervals. And it's going to be delivering your insulin based on your setting. So we're thinking about insulin sensitivity factor, where you have that. Your target glucose is going to be utilized in that calculation, and then also your delivery limits. With automatic bolus, you will end up with more IOB quicker. Temp basal is going to deliver the recommended amount of insulin over 30-minute timeframes. So within here, anytime if you're new to loop, it's going to start you on the temp basal only dosing strategy as a default. Most people recommend that you start initially with temp basal only as you start learning about loop and the system. But in all honesty, with the people that I work with that are getting started on loop, I do have them try and make that choice up front. Because here's the thing, if you're starting with temp basal only, what oftentimes will happen is people end up with more aggressive insulin sensitivity factor settings and this high max basal to get it to work more aggressively. So if you're looking for that aggressiveness and you think that it might lead to you making these really aggressive settings, then when you switch over to auto bolus, it's going to crash you a lot. So I saw this a lot when automatic bolus first became available with a lot of different people. And that would be the reason. I know I did that when I was using temp basal only. I definitely made my settings more aggressive so that it would make up for my mistakes a little quicker, because I personally I'm not a perfect carb counter. I'm not perfect at, covering all those things. So I really like loop to jump in and help me get back into range, of course, as fast as possible. So that's something to consider. Then we're looking at the ability to utilize the combination of the two. So if you're using loop with patches, you would go in and you would set a BG switching threshold. So your dosing strategy within the loop app would need to be set to automatic bolus. That gets a lot of people. A lot of times they'll leave it on the temp basal only, and they're like, it's not working. And it's just because you actually have to go in, switch the dosing strategy to auto bolus, but it'll only do those auto boluses if you go or you predict to go above that BG switching threshold. So some common ones that people will set it to, it's like 180 or a little higher, like 200, 250. So I put in here on this next slide, this is something I pulled from Night Scout, which is a combination of the two. So you can actually see what that BG switching threshold. So I think somebody needs to mute their YouTube. So we have on this page here, they have their program basal. They start getting a temp basal increase. And then, as you can see, their blood sugar was going up. So then they hit their BG switch threshold and they started to get these auto boluses. So that's what the data looks. If you have just Temp Basal, you're going to see just these blue increases. If you're running Auto Bolus, you have these, and both you have a combination of the two. Important to note is they're both still going to take away basal if you're predicted to go below your target, or you reach that suspend threshold. So they will both help prevent hypos, but then just remember that the auto bolus, you end up with more IOB quicker. So I like to call it less, it's not as forgiving as Temp Basal only. So let's give like a scenario. Let's say you have a 3-year-old little looper, and they are very unpredictable. So as most 3-year-olds are, they randomly will start running around the house like a mad person, and there was no way for you to possibly know that that was about to happen. And let's say they're using auto bolus. Well, they might have gone into that running with a whole meal's worth of auto bolus insulin on board, and insulin on board from that meal. So most likely that little 3-year-old is going to end up low. Whereas if it was Temp Basal only, there's more of a chance to not end up with so much IOB, and it would be more forgiving if they were to go and do that random bout of activity. So a lot of times for the little ones, having that little bit of safety net is a good idea. Also, if someone is very fearful of hypoglycemia, we don't want them to leave loop because they get some lows. So maybe Temp Basal only is a better option for them as well. So most adults, we are pretty predictable, and we can utilize overrides, higher target blood sugars, overall insulin need adjustments to prevent hypos. And so the big thing that we're thinking about with auto bolus is unplanned activity. This is definitely going to be a cause of lows. So we need to plan ahead a little more, give ourselves a little more time in advance. So a big thing that we see a lot is with physical activity, that amount of insulin you go with on board is huge because the digestion is going to slow down. So if you go into this activity with lots of IOB, slowed down digestion, blood sugar is like a guaranteed tank. So you could consider, based on the predictability of your individual lifestyle, you could utilize that as a dosing strategy and which one you might want to go with. Something else to think about is the say without bolusing. It's a common thing that gets people into some trouble with loop. And then we'll also touch on remote bolusing, because same thing, and putting in those entries for the future. So sometimes we'll go in, we type in the amount of carbs that we're eating, but we don't want to deliver that bolus right away. Or maybe we go in, we type it in, and we're trying to cover protein and fat. So another thing, if you put in a longer absorption time, you're almost always still going to see a bolus recommendation in there, even if you put a 8-hour absorption time. So making it much longer, Loop still wants to deliver insulin up front in most situations, unless your blood sugar is low or predicted to go below your suspend threshold. So when you do this, like you can see in this example on here, if you type in 0 or something less, maybe the recommendation is 3 units, and you want to deliver 1 unit instead. You have to keep in mind that Loop is still on that next interval. Loop is seeing all of those carbs on board. So it's seeing carb on board, which means Loop is thinking, okay, it needs to give more insulin. So you're going to get that 40% correction dose if you're using auto bolus, or that temp basal increase if you're using temp basal only. So how do you combat that? If you truly don't need insulin right there, I'll try an even longer absorption time than what you think. You can put on a temporary higher target blood sugar to prevent loop from kicking in. Or you can save without bolusing, and eventually loop is going to see, okay, the glucose isn't trending, and it'll start trending up, and it'll start taking it away. But no matter what, you're going to end up with some insulin. And that happens a lot. People will enter in, like, you think of it vice versa too. You do a remote bolus, but you don't enter in the carb. So you do a remote bolus, no carb entry. Loop is seeing all of this insulin on board, and then you're getting a negative prediction, and you're going to get minus temp basal in those next 5-minute increments for an extended period of time, because loop is seeing no carb, lots of insulin, predicted blood sugar is negative something probably. So same thing here. If you're looking at the recommended bolus, it says 3 units. Then you press 0, your recommended blood sugar, or your eventually blood sugar, is going to come out and be something way above your target. It's going to say eventually like 300 or 400. I'm sure, I know some people have seen things in the thousands and stuff. So we do want to try and avoid that. So similar thing is going to happen if you schedule like a protein fat adjustment for the future. It's going to look just like this screen that we see here on the slide deck. Is loop is going to recommend a bolus. You're going to edit it to 0. And then you always need to keep in mind that loop is going to be delivering more insulin in 5 minutes as it resets that and sees the extra carb on board. Does that make sense? So,
Kathryn, do you want people to?
yeah, I would love people to interact. Love the interaction.
Okay, if anyone is unclear on what Kathryn's talked about up to this point, kind of make your questions kind of brief, and but you can unmute so that you can voice it, or else put it in the chat. You got them quiet.
It's either I'm great at explaining it, or they have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't know which one.
Well, I'm going to be brave and turn my video on. Maybe everyone could turn their video on, because I'm sitting here nodding my head at what you're saying. And I don't know if that would help you to, or people can say, you know, this and whatever. Anyway, I don't know if you like getting facial expressions, but yeah, I'll go back on mute. Yeah.
That's great, Marianne. Thanks.
So do you guys, what's your understanding on insulin sensitivity factor? Because when it comes down to it, this is going to be the really important setting within loop to determine, all right, well, what's it going to be delivering within loop, within these adjustments in the background. So this is really confusing. When we're adjusting insulin sensitivity factor, the smaller numbers mean it's more aggressive. The bigger numbers mean it's less aggressive. So I see a lot of times people will adjust it and they adjust it the wrong way. So I have to keep in mind, well, which way does it adjust? And think about the starting point. So a starting point recommendation for insulin sensitivity factor, if you're ever curious of what calculation the clinicians do, it's usually 1,700 divided by your total daily dose of insulin. So that could be a starting point. But these settings are super duper important within Loop, because Loop is one of the few systems that is using everything that you put in.
Let's try something. I have a great idea. I've never done this.
All right, let's do it.
sometime during the next presentations, we'll do something, and whoever asks the first question when we ask you to teach us what you just learned, will get a prize from Loop and Learn. I can't tell you what it is yet because I just thought about it, but if Kathryn puts out a question like, how would you explain ISF? First one, hit the buzzer and answer correctly. We'll send out a prize. What the heck?
I love it. Great idea. Yeah, because teaching back is one of the best ways to learn. So if you can tell me something, then you got it, which is great. And so we got a question about which version works for a 19-year-old that doesn't like to bolus for a meal. And it comes down to, you can always make either work. It's all about those settings. So if you're using temp basal only, you would want to knock that max basal setting up so that it's not going to be very restricted in how much it can increase it by. Then you also want to watch the ISF settings, because sometimes what will happen is you see it a lot with forget to bolus, not so much like not wanting to bolus. But if you forget to bolus, Loop is typically going to crank things up a lot, and it cranks it up too much because that rise is happening so fast, and Loop thinks that there's more there than what actually is. This happens a lot post low too. Like if you don't enter it with a lollipop absorption time, it's part of the reason why sometimes people see low to low taps. But you would want to watch that ISF setting, because you want to avoid Loop cranking up so much because of how fast that rise is happening, that it then leads to a crash on the back end. So for a 19-year-old doesn't like to bolus for a meal, probably auto bolus is going to be the dosing strategy that you would choose. But you can definitely make either work. And then you can also think about, there is some other systems. I'm a big fan of Loop. It's my absolute favorite. But for teenagers, you could get some better luck with like, I think it's called IAPS now, not FACS anymore. But that algorithm does work pretty nicely for not entering in any carbohydrates, as long as you're using it properly. So I would also look into what are the other open source options that are out there. Let's see.
Okay, so you have no takers to explain back to you ISF. One more time, can anyone explain to Kathryn in clear terms what ISF is and why it's important? You didn't think there would be called on in class, did you?
I'll call on somebody. I think they'll know that I'm going to call on them. Oh, actually, I have a couple of options. Dave, I'm picking you. Dave, tell everybody what ISF is.
I'm reading from the Loop app. It's the amount your glucose is expected to drop per 1 unit of insulin.
Yeah.
So mine is set to, let's see, what time is it now? It's 38 milligrams per deciliter per unit.
And what does it mean exactly to someone who's never heard it before?
It means how much insulin does it take to get your blood sugar to drop, really. I guess it's a simple way of describing it.
Yeah, and it's over the full time of the insulin. So with Loop, because it, people normally when they use it as a correction range, they tend to have it be a smaller number than it really is, because that little bit of insulin keeps working a long time and it keeps adding every 5 minutes. So that's why lots of times when people come to Loop, they have to increase what they thought of as that correction factor.
Yeah, they're kind of playing the waiting game on it to get to its full delivery, which can take a little bit of time. And you can also use the double orange arrows, but I usually tell people to avoid that, just because, again, we're going into the forgiveness. A lot of times if you check the orange double arrows, there might be a bolus sitting in there, a bolus recommendation, but then loop is kicking in 5 minutes later, it can be a completely different bolus recommendation, but you already delivered maybe a huge bolus and there's no way to take it back now. So unless you are running really, really high, so like, like 250 high, then I tell people to try and avoid the double orange arrows. Just wait it out, let loop do it. Does anyone know how insulin sensitivity factor is calculated within loop? It's actually calculated the same way you probably did with MDI. So if you think back to MDI days, if you ever were, most of us do start MDI, they probably gave you a correction factor. EG minus target divided by insulin sensitivity factor. Is familiar with that calculation? Yeah. So you can test out your ISF settings and see, like, okay, so Dave's ISF was 38. Does 1 unit of insulin truly bring you down about 38 points in your desired time frame? So if you mess around with that calculation, you can see that those smaller numbers are going to give you more insulin. Those bigger numbers come out to less.
Yeah, Kathryn, this is Mira. A quick question and clarification. Hi, how are you? When you said that it's going to drop you 38 points within the time frame, you are talking 6 hours there, correct?
Because that's what loop's default duration of insulin action is. Yeah, you can't change it.
Do you typically have to wait the full 6 hours to make sure, or how long would you wait to see what a good point is to see how many points you have dropped?
Yeah, so we're kind of going back to what Marion said. Like most people are going to make that setting more aggressive when you start on loop because of it only being 40% and you wanting to get more right off the bat. So it should bring you back into range in about 3 to 4 hours. And it's all dependent on blood sugar, and if you ate, it'll probably bring it back into range quicker than that. Truly looking at it, it's based off that kind of true insulin action curve. So, and another question is, how many ISF variables is recommended to have programmed? I mean, that's really, there's a lot of different ideas out there for how to best use loop. Some people use a lot of insulin sensitivity factors. Some people try to match it to true insulin that would work like in manual mode if you were to open loop. Some people do a strategy with like one basal profile. Others do multiple basal profiles. So I don't like saying, well, there's no hard answer to it, but there's no like, you should have this many ISF variables within loop. I personally have, I think 4, maybe 5. And I look at data all the time, and some people have 1 for the entire day. Some people have a lot more. But when you are getting multiple values of the insulin sensitivity settings, then you again need to think about the overall calculation that loop is going to come to. So like, let's say somebody has an ISF of 30 at 3 a.m. and then at 7 a.m. it jumps to 5. That's pretty aggressive. But that's a big change in overall ISF settings. So because of the way it's calculating, it's going to a lot of times lead to a wonky, eventually, blood glucose prediction. which can end up leading you to a suboptimal blood sugar. So you want to make sure with those ISF settings that if you do have big changes, you need to gradually go into them. You don't want to have these big jumps from one ISF value to another, or else that calculation for ISF is going to get a little bit mixed up and get you. I've seen some predicted blood sugars of extreme, like 1049 and things like that. So I do have to take that into account too. But yeah, everyone's different for how many ISF variables they have. And typically we do need more than one from true needs because of the fact that, like, oftentimes in the morning, we're more insulin resistant and producing all these stress hormones. We're in a fasted state. We just overall need more during that time segment. So when we're sleeping, we're not moving around at all. Whereas during the day, we are moving around at all. We might need, differences in our ISF settings because of that. And if you have a high blood sugar and it seems like it's kind of stuck there, then there is a couple of things you can do. I mean, it's always going to be our inclination to rage bolus, which you really want to avoid. So remember, just throwing tons of insulin at it is not going to make the insulin work faster. So it's hard, I know. I do it too, totally guilty, but nothing is going to make the insulin work faster. So you have to give it the time. You can remind yourself, okay, well, the insulin peaks around, when's my insulin peak? Did it peak yet? And where's my blood sugar still at? Okay, well, you might have a good bit of IOB still, but it's done most of what's going to hit. So you might need some more insulin. So I would recommend, if you really feel like you need to give yourself more insulin, hit the pre-meal and deliver your insulin that way. Just a little bit safer rather than entering in the ghost carbs. Because then if you use pre-meal, it's also going to leave your basal on most of the time, since you're aiming for that lower target. Whereas if you enter in the ghost carb, then it is just a lot of times going to take away the basal following. That makes sense?
Do you have a rule of thumb for at what time you put on your pre-meal?
I would say if it's above 250, you have enough wiggle room.
And what if you're at target, or let's say you're 120? Would you throw on a pre-meal just regularly?
Well, in those, so like if you just ate, I would think about whether or not it was a meal that you were familiar with, or maybe it was a total guess. Because if it was a total guess, then you'd be better off going in and changing the carb entry. Because then it's going to recommend a bolus as well if you're behind. So like,
that's kind of, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's kind of, you were talking about ghost carbs, and now you're talking about editing the carb entry. Are those two different things? And can you clarify what you mean by the two different things?
Yeah. So ghost carb entry is you're not actually eating any carbohydrate, but you're putting it in there. Editing the carb.
You put it in now. Is that
so like,
okay.
Yeah, like you're high and you want to deliver insulin. So you go in, do it, and it's happening now. Whereas when you go in and edit the active carb one, it's saying that you had this carbohydrate back when you first ate, but you just underput it, and you want loop to help you make up what you didn't initially put in there. So typically when we go in and edit it, it's because you actually, people can use that for ghost carb too, so definitely a reality. But usually if you're doing ghost carb, they just put it in as a separate entry. But you very well could go in and just enter in ghost carb to the past entry that you did. And then essentially it would be the same thing. It would just timestamp it back a little more. If it timestamps it back a little more, you would probably end up getting a little bit less insulin recommended initially, since it did have that back timestamp. So like, let's say I went in and edited my 731. If I go in and edit my 731 carb entry, then I'll get a bolus recommendation. And then, but if I go in and enter in ghost carb of a random amount, but it's the same amount that I was editing by, then that one that you're doing with ghost carb will typically be a little bit bigger, since you're saying that you're having it now and not in the past that loop has already helped some for. Does that make sense? You can kind of look at it on your screen too, just don't deliver any insulin. So if you go in, like if I go into my last carb entry, you go in, you edit it, don't actually change anything, but I could change it to like 80, press continue, it's 2.9. And then I could go in, so I originally entered in 50. So if I went in and entered in 30, then it's 3.25. So you see how that delivery is bigger? Because you're time stamping it now rather than in the past.
There was a question from Dina about how are you looking at your data? What are you looking at?
Like my old data. Oh, how are you looking at your data? I personally look mostly at Night Scout, because Night Scout gives you everything. You can see all the overrides you did. You can add notes in. You can put little notes with your carb entries so you remember what food you ate. You just have full visibility to everything. If Night Scout, if you don't want to pay for it, or you don't want to have to build it on your own, then Tide Pool is the next best option. The only downside is it doesn't load in your settings, and you can't see the overrides, which I'm sure at some point they will have, but they do not currently. Yeah, Night Scout is the big one. So you can reference back to the last educational series that was done on how to interpret Night Scout.
Mhm.
See what changes you need in there. For meal dosing, there's 3 meal strategies, perhaps more suitable for people on high protein, high fat. There's also carb only dosing strategies, both work for different people. So yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. So a lot of people only cover carbohydrates, whereas other people kind of take it a step further and also cover protein and fat. My general recommendation would be, it really is dependent on your diet. So let's say you're eating a meal with a good bit of carb, decent amount of protein, but the protein is not more than the carb content, and the fat's also in like 4 grams. In that scenario, so our preferred energy source is carbohydrate. So if you're having the sufficient amount of carbohydrate, then that's what your body is going to utilize for fuel. And you don't need to cover the protein and fat unless it was high fat, which I can come back to. So for that situation, you're covering carb. Let's say you just have protein. Really, with type 1 diabetes, there's no free foods. That protein, because you didn't have it with carbohydrate, is going to eventually turn into glucose. But it's hard for your body to do that, so it's going to take longer. So you won't see that impact very quickly. So if it was, let's say like a cheese stick, Loop can probably handle that. But let's say it was a 12-ounce steak, you're going to get a rise from that. Or, like you had just salmon for dinner, going to get a delayed rise from that. And you would be better off in a better position entering it in, because then you're not having to wait for Loop to play catch up. So then the other thing is high fat. So high fat, I would recommend utilizing an override, because the auto bolus is set for your typical needs. And when you have a high fat meal, that's not your typical needs. Because what high fat does is it increases triglycerides in the bloodstream, makes your liver secrete more glucose, and you're more insulin resistant for about 6 to 8 hours. So most people are going to need more insulin to do the same thing with those high fat meals. So utilizing an override can be really helpful to help get auto bolus working harder, and just get loop ahead of it from a blood sugar standpoint, taking your basal up. So generally, people need anywhere from like 40 to 80% more for those high fat meals.
How do you define a high fat meal?
And usually most people, it's about 25 grams. So if you have 2 slices of pizza, high fat. If you order takeout from a Chinese restaurant, high fat.
And sugar.
Yeah, yes. So yeah, most restaurant foods honestly are going to come out to high fat, because they put all the butter or oils in to make it taste good so that you get addicted to their food and come back, because fat tastes great. So
Okay, so are there more slides, or do you want to just open this up to questions?
yeah, we can just open it up to questions.
Okay, back to all of y'all. Any questions? Do you understand when you would use temp basal versus an automatic bolus? No more prizes, by the way. Babe won today. Do you understand everything perfectly today, and you could teach the next class?
I think that's a yes.
Okay, I'm completely new to looping, but sometimes the sensor is a bit wacky. Would that be a good time to like be on the temp so it doesn't go crazy adjusting?
It would definitely help. Yeah. Also, when Dexcom is really wonky, a good thing to know is you can go into Apple Health and type in what your actual blood sugar is. That's going to overwrite what Dexcom is feeding in. So then you get the correct blood sugar in there for Loop to respond to. You can also utilize an override. So I wouldn't base your dosing strategy off of like your faulty Dexcoms, essentially. I would utilize either entering it in. It's every 5 minutes that it loads in a new blood sugar value, so that can get to be tedious. So you can utilize an override where you put in, like, let's say Dexcom is reading like 20 points higher than where you actually are. So Loop is going to end up giving you more auto boluses than what you want, because you're not actually 20 points higher than what it's reading. So go in and edit your target blood sugar. Let's say your target is 100. You go in and put your target blood sugar to 120, so that it's not crashing you out from the false things you're getting fed in from Dexcom. And same thing if it's reading you lower than where you actually are. For that, you're going to be best off, though, putting in the Apple Health data, so that's not suspending your basal and causing you to go up a lot more than what you want.
So I had a question just as it relates to the auto bolus and being able to, with the patches, increase the factor.
Mhm.
And I've always just thought, well, if I bump the factor up to 75%, it just seems like I'm compensating in a different way than all my other settings. And have you ever bumped that up and used it?
Yeah, I played around with it. I put it to like 50%, 70%. And I have to say, I do think 40% is the right place for it, because anytime I change it, you're going to wind up with more lows, because you're getting so much more insulin up front. And we know how quickly those blood sugar reading values can change. So like my last reading was 147 diagonal arrow up, and now it's 230 or 135 straight arrow across. So loop would have already responded to the 147, but now it's straightened out. So, just more aggressive. It's just going to end up more IOB, less forgiveness, potentially more lows.
Thanks.
How burdensome do you find this to be?
Loop in general?
Well, you're constantly correcting, and as opposed to just kind of more standard. Do you find you're tweaking a lot? Do you find that everyone does what you do?
Honestly, I rarely touch my loop app.
Okay.
Rarely. I only go in there personally if I really screw something up.
Mhm.
And I actually use a Fresa if I really screw something up because I'm impatient. And then I go in there, of course, to enter in my carbs. But otherwise, I'm really not going in there. The people that usually need to go in a little more are kind of a lot kids. If you have a little one, you're going to need to go in there a lot more. It's because there's so many moving pieces to it, and their settings are changing more often because you're growing and doing all kinds of wacky things. But once your settings are dialed in and everything, loop should take so much of the burden off for you. You shouldn't have to be working so much within the loop app. And if you are, you're probably working against it.
Yeah.
And ending up playing a little bit of tug of war games with it.
How does all of this discussion apply to when you're exercising?
Apply when you're exercising.
Uh-huh.
So in a lot of ways. So exercise is so important, and you should never avoid it because of type 1 diabetes, which unfortunately is something that commonly happens, is people are scared to exercise because of fluctuations in blood sugar.
I should share with you that the admins of Loop and Learn started this during COVID, and we have in our Slack channel an exercise challenge, and we all post. It's not a challenge, it's a reminder. And more people are actually putting in what they do, and everyone just congratulates them. You get a lot of really positive feedback. So sometimes it's helpful to just share it with the community that you're doing that. But so dealing with Temp Basal versus Auto Bolus while you're exercising?
Yeah, so you still, a big thing is you want to avoid too much Temp Basal increases or IOB. So a lot of time, or Auto Boluses. A lot of times what people think they need to do around exercise is go in with a blood sugar that is a lot higher than what they would typically aim for. But even if you have an override on, you have to keep in mind that loop is still trying to keep you at whatever that target is set to. So if you set the target to 180, but your blood sugar is at 270, you think you're going to wind up with more insulin?
Okay.
So if you're going in with your blood sugar way above target, you're going to wind up with more IOB during your workout, which you don't want, right? Because IOB is the primary cause of hypoglycemia during exercise. So then you're going to need a really fast-acting carbohydrate, preferably with the first ingredient of dextrose, to get yourself back into range. And then what can also happen is, let's say you had maybe something not as quick. Maybe you had like some peanut butter crackers to treat your low. And then you can also expect that you had to treat that low, but you're also going to get a back end rise. So a lot of times people will stop exercise, and then all of a sudden their blood sugar is going up and up and up because the digestion is ramping up again. So you want to make sure that when you're treating your lows or with physical activity, you're treating it with that really high glycemic index food so that it can impact your blood sugar right when you need it. Dextrose.
Great.
Yeah, but ideally you are going in and you still need to send in advance, because if you're think about like a temporary basal adjustment, or if you're changing your basal rates. Say you need to make a basal adjustment because every day at 4 p.m. you go low. You're not changing the 4 p.m. basal, right? We're going an hour or 2 hours back, depending on how low you went, the duration of the fall, and the magnitude of it. Same thing with overrides. Because of the insulin action time, you want to set them in advance for exercise, so that you're not ending up like, if you eat a meal 2 hours before, you're not going to get all of those automatic dosages or big temp basal increases following. So what I usually recommend is setting a target higher. As much as you can, try to leave the overall insulin needs at 100%. It's because it works better with a eventually blood sugar prediction standpoint. So for exercise, something like 140 to 140 or 140 to 160. There's something higher than what you normally aim for to prevent those crank up in insulin delivery that you might have gotten otherwise. I did also do, it was a very mini little research thing I did for graduating with masters. And I did, well, what if you only set the override 30 minutes in advance for physical activity with loop? And I mean, that actually was effective as well. When they set an override, the target that they could choose from was 140 to 200. And within that range of, I think it was 30 minutes of cardio I had them do, nobody went low. So with loop, it seems that you might not have to do it as much in advance that you would have had to have done with a standard pump. But again, it was really small. It was like 5 people. So it needs to be tested more.
Well, I like that you're recommending exercise. You know, maybe you can tell them, give them homework to the next time we hear from anyone from IDS, that they can at least report 1 episode of exercise or daily exercise. Question here from Dina: does it matter with the length of the exercise to set an override?
Yep. So the longer the exercise, the more likely you are to go low. So you want to set it probably further in advance for that. And duration wise, ideally that override is turning off about 20 minutes before the workout ends, so that it's kicking back to normal settings and you don't get that post-exercise rise. But then you also need to think about post-exercise. If you did a long duration bout of activity, a lot of times you're going to be more sensitive and overall insulin needs following are going to go down. Same thing if you do something like really strenuous. You're going to be more sensitive to that insulin, plus you're going to deplete your glycogen stores. So when your body goes to refuel those, you'll often get called DOH, delayed onset hypoglycemia. So you might also need to run an increased target blood sugar for an extended period of time. Most people need it like about 8 to 12 hours, but it could be up to 48, increasing that target post-exercise.
Does that have to do with the intensity of the exercise or duration, or both?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
So like if it's like built in, it's like something you typically do, you're not going to need an override if it's like a quick 5-minute walk. But if you do like a 1-hour walk that you wouldn't typically do, then you'll probably need to take your target up for a little bit.
What, I had a quick question. What type of so the peak, JRF peak says if you were hypo the day before, you had a pretty significant hypo to not do the exercise the next day. But that's probably more real vigorous exercise they're talking about, or?
Yeah, they're probably, honestly, I don't know. Maybe they're worried about you depleted.
Yeah, it's the depletion of the glycogen stores. Is what they're,
yeah. And just eat more carbs. It's all good.
I like that. I like that idea. I'd like to just go ahead and exercise. Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, ideally, you're getting it at least steps every day. You're getting you're aiming for about 8,000 steps. If you're nowhere near that, then don't walk out the door and try to do 8,000 steps in a day.
Mhm.
You're going to gradually increase to it. If you're walking about 2,000 steps right now, all right, well, let's aim for 2,500 the next day. And then once you reach that, all right, let's take it to 3,000. So slow, gradual increases from where you're at. Talk to your healthcare provider too about what's safe.
I think if you have a severe low, like a severe low, and the next day you just might not feel great. So just do an easy walk. Just don't stop, because the benefit just far outweighs any of that. So your homework is next time you hear from IDS, you will have in your mind what exercise you did and any questions you have about that, because as Dave said, so many things to think about when exercising. It sounds a little bit like Dr. Seuss. It sounds like it should be a poem, but it's true. There's so much to think about in managing diabetes, type 1 diabetes. It's you should all just congratulate yourselves for being here to learn. It is not an easy walk in the park. So let's see, there's one more thing from Marion. Exercising before eating works better for me. When I take a walk after a meal to lower the peak, I limit how long the walk I will take.
Yep. And it makes so much sense, because if you're going before a walk, you don't have a lot of IOB. If you go post-walk, you're slowing down the digestion of the food you just ate and you have lots of IOB. So that's where you're likely to kind of crash down, have to treat it, and then you go up after, because you had the low treatment. The only reason you needed the low treatment was because the digestion slowed down. So then you wind up in the 200s kind of thing. You can also think like if you're worried about lows, which I should also mention, there's some forms of exercise where you can actually see a rise in your blood sugar. It's not because of the exercise, it's because of the stress hormones that we're producing and the lactic acid. But the morning, if you're worried about lows, could be a great time to get that workout in, because you have no insulin on board. If you look at your settings, I betcha that if not everyone on here, almost everyone has the most aggressive settings first thing in the morning. So working out during that time frame, you get that foot to floor or dawn phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, impact. You don't have insulin on board, you're more insulin resistant. So chances of going low are quite minimal, going pretty low.
Well, thank you. We've reached the hour point. You are extraordinarily knowledgeable. Thank you for sharing that with us tonight. This video will be released hopefully by tomorrow morning, all things going well in technology. But it's been excellent. A reminder, this coming Monday, we're doing an open mic night, same time as we started with Kathryn, to discuss automatic bolus versus temp, and anything else you have. Just open mic, not being recorded. Just come and share your questions and we'll do our best to answer them. You're getting lots of thanks. Really appreciate the time, and you're welcome to join us if you just feel you need to share some more expertise with us on Monday. Thank you, everyone. I hope you all have a great day, evening, dinner, lunch, whatever time it is where you are. And thank you again. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah.